The woman had just opened the door, when suddenly a mysterious person in a raincoat grabbed her by the throat. A wave of intense fear instantly overwhelmed her. The woman struggled frantically, trying to escape, but was still dragged back, and her life was cruelly ended. Afterwards, the person in the raincoat drew the curtains, and shockingly took out a steel saw from a bag, apparently intending to dismember her. What grudge did he have against the woman, to resort to such a cruel method? Hello everyone, I am Detective K. Welcome back to the Shadow Catcher Files Bureau. Today, let's review file number 052 from the mystery section, starring the acclaimed actor Samuel L. Jackson in his latest film, Scarred. Chicago, USA, in the year 2023. Lawson is a homicide detective. That day, he had just solved a gang-related vendetta, and was drinking in his car, when suddenly his subordinate came looking for him. Without a word, he pulled out a case report. It was the woman who had been brutally murdered. In the photo, the woman's torso was missing. Her legs and arms were arranged in the shape of a cross. The scene could be described as too gruesome to bear. Perhaps only a demon could commit such a crime. Lawson's face was grave after reading it. Besides feeling palpitations from the killer's ruthlessness, it was also because this scene seemed eerily familiar. 6 years ago, there was a serial killer in Chicago. At that time, the killer had taken 5 lives. The crime scenes were identical to the one in the photo. But even now, Lawson had not been able to catch the killer. His interest was instantly piqued. Upon learning that the murder had occurred in the UK, he decided to go there immediately to assist with the investigation. The next day, UK Chief Inspector Kessler and local Chief Glenn together received the long-distance visitor Lawson. As soon as the three met, Lawson couldn't wait to ask about the progress of the case. Glenn didn't hide anything, and speculated that the killer had arranged the victim in the shape of a cross, most likely due to their belief in a cult, satanic empire icon. But Lawson didn't think so, insisting that the case was more complicated than imagined. Glenn could understand the level of importance Lawson placed on it, and told him that the police had already questioned the victim's neighbors, finding an old man very suspicious, who had argued with the victim on the day of the incident. After saying this, Glenn hurriedly took Lawson to the scene. On the way, Lawson noticed Glenn's family portrait, and asked what his son's name was, only to find Glenn with a sorrowful expression. And then he revealed a terrible piece of news, that his son had died accidentally a year ago, which caused a rift between Glenn and his wife. The wife even chose to have an affair due to emptiness. Lawson didn't expect his casual remark to be an apology, but it touched Glenn's deepest scar. Fortunately, the two quickly arrived at the crime scene. Glenn detailed the reconstruction of the scene at that time. He then handed Lawson a key. This was found at the scene, but it doesn't fit any lock in the house. It's highly likely left by the perpetrator. While the two were talking, Glenn received a call from his wife. Immediately after, the neighbor who had argued with the victim returned. Glenn noticed a pair of boots in the trash can in front of his door. He then identified himself, wanting to question the old man. "Stay away from my turf, officer," but the old man was hostile and even more so, angrily sent him away upon learning Glenn didn't have a search warrant. This left Glenn with a snub. Dejectedly, he discarded the boots. He thought the investigation for the day had ended, but as he turned around, he noticed an elderly woman watching him carefully. Intuition told Glenn that she must know something, and the old woman confessed truthfully that she indeed had heard the old man arguing fiercely with the victim on the day of the incident. She had barely spoken a few words, when suddenly there was the sound of a door closing from outside the window. Glenn hurriedly got up to check, and found that the old man was preparing to leave. Strangely enough, he picked up the boots that Glenn had thrown into the trash can. This caused the old man's suspicion in Glenn's mind to skyrocket. But since there was no evidence, he could only continue the investigation. As night fell, Lawson and Glenn returned separately. However, what they didn't know was that the dreadful raincoat man had appeared again. At this moment, a woman was watching TV at home, when she suddenly heard a rapid knocking at the door. Unguarded, she got up to answer it. Unexpectedly, it was the man in the raincoat. He pushed the woman to the ground in one swift motion. Then he cruelly murdered her. Lawson, unaware of this, was drowning his sorrows with alcohol in the hotel. Just then, Glenn suddenly called. He decided to go with Lawson to surveil the victim's house. On the way, Lawson brought up his former partner, Walker. He is a very intelligent person. He now lives in London, England. Lawson plans to go look for Walker tomorrow, to ask for his opinion on the dismemberment case. When they arrived outside the victim's house, Glenn told the drunken Lawson to wait in the car. He got out of the car to check himself. However, as soon as he approached, Lawson saw the old man sneakily climbing over the wall to escape. He quickly shouted a warning to Glenn. At the same time, he started the car to intercept. They quickly worked together to subdue the old man. But the other party angrily stated that they were not the murderer. At the time of the crime, they were still at work, and had a perfect alibi. Then, guiltily told Glenn that the escape was only because they were in debt to loan sharks. and feared being arrested for it. As for the argument with the victim that day, it was because she had gotten a dog, which severely disturbed their rest. Seeing that the old mont's answers were impeccable, Glenn was momentarily at a loss, and could only let him go for the time being. Afterwards, he returned home, entered his son's room, and felt the little happiness that remained. His wife Mary was very worried about Glenn's state, and sought him out the next day, deciding to invite Lawson over for dinner, hoping it would improve her husband's mood. But Glenn hadn't decided yet, when he received a notification from Kessler that another dismemberment case had occurred last night. By the time Glenn arrived at the scene, he found the victim's manner of death was exactly the same as the previous one. Immediately after, Lawson appeared. He put on his glasses and carefully examined the scene arranged by the deceased, and he simulated the murderer's crime process. Subsequently, Lawson saw a bright red blood footprint on the ground. He speculated that the murderer must have left a mark. Hearing this, Glenn immediately sprayed a chemical reagent. He turned on the ultraviolet light. Sure enough, a cross-shaped mark appeared on the wall. Lawson recognized at a glance that it was the Egyptian key to the gate of eternal life. He couldn't help but blurt out a comment. Why do serial killers always use religion as a reason? But Glenn had no time to ponder these things. He decided to return to the first victim's home, to see if any information had been overlooked. The two searched carefully, but found no symbols. Just as Glenn was feeling frustrated, Lawson suddenly noticed that the arrangement in the room was somewhat unusual. Normally, candlesticks are placed outside the door or on the windowsill, but here it was placed on the bookshelf. Lawson looked up with confusion. He immediately spotted an upside-down book. He quickly took it out and turned to the page with the bookmark. He discovered that the content was Matthew chapter 7 verse 15. Lawson immediately realized 715 was the code for the serial killings 6 years ago. From this, it's clear that the killer has either resurfaced, or is extremely familiar with the case from that year, using this to imitate the crime. And Glenn is more inclined to the latter, because he could tell from the book. Treatment. Abandoning all their posses, the killer has a strong dislike for believers of other faiths. Covenant. However, these are ultimately just speculations. Further investigation is still needed. Glenn called the mother of the second victim, asking if she knew with whom her daughter had a falling out. After pondering for a moment, she remembered her daughter had been with a man named Colin. Later, for some unknown reason, the two suddenly chose to break up. This gave Glenn a jolt, and he decided to start an investigation on Colin. At this moment, Catherine approached and told him that the old mont's alibi had been confirmed, completely clearing his suspicion. However, Glenn didn't care about these details. Is an extremely dangerous person. Meanwhile, Lawson was deep in thought. He posted information about the Chicago murder case and the two recent cases on the wall, trying hard to find a connection between them. Suddenly, his former partner Walker made a phone call, asking Lawson to meet at the pub. As soon as they met, Lawson immediately blamed Walker for resigning abruptly back then. Walker admitted he was not as good as Lawson in solving cases, but the main reason was still the serial killer they had failed to catch. So he was very curious why Lawson had come all the way to England to work on a case. Upon hearing this, a look of sorrow appeared on Lawson's face. It turns out that among the 5 victims 6 years ago, one of them was Lawson's wife. That's why he investigated tirelessly, just wanting to give his wife an explanation. This made Walker take a deep breath, instantly understanding what his old friend was thinking. So he took the initiative to open the file, deciding to help him one more time. The next day, Glenn drove to Colin's house, intending to inquire about the second victim's situation. However, upon hearing his purpose, Colin showed a disdainful smile, stating outright that unless a lawyer was present, he would not say another word. With no other choice, Glenn had to take him to the interrogation room, and Colin honestly confessed everything. He was working at a security company in another city on the day of the incident, and didn't return home until the next evening. Many colleagues could attest to this. As for the scar on his forehead, it was accidentally sustained while picking up his phone. Glenn naturally wouldn't believe these words, but he chose not to delve deeper. Instead, he asked about Colin's relationship with the victim, learning that the two had been together for a long time. But Colin's next words made Glenn and Lawson's hearts tremble. She is a lost soul. Hearing this, Glenn continued to inquire without any change in expression, trying to coax more words out of Colin. I think we're done here, don't you? But this intention was seen through by the lawyer, who unceremoniously ended the interrogation. That very night, Lawson and Walker returned to the tavern, accompanied by Glenn and Kessler. Glenn had already found out online that Colin had been a member of a cult. Walker also realized that the so-called cross was the key to the afterlife, perhaps in the killer's eyes. This was done to allow the victim to be reincarnated. Afterwards, Lawson took out the investigation report of the Chicago murder case. Glenn discovered that after each victim's death, the jewelry on their body was taken away. This was completely different from the last 2 cases. However, no one expected That Colin, who was under suspicion, was wearing a raincoat at that moment, standing quietly outside Glenn's house. He looked at Mary on the sofa, venting his repressed desires. Could it be that Colin was the dreaded raincoat man? The next morning, Glenn found the cult that Colin had joined, and learned that he was expelled 6 months ago due to differing beliefs. Then the cult leader assured Glenn that although their ideologies were different, they would never allow their followers to take lives. But when Glenn asked about Colin, the cult leader did not give a direct answer. Clearly, he too had noticed the extreme darkness in Colin's heart. As night fell, Glenn, following Mary's suggestion, invited Lawson and Walker to come over to his house as guests. During the meal, Walker and Mary chatted happily. "Be careful, he's quite charming," Lawson joked, warning Glenn to watch out for his wife being charmed away. This remark seemed to make Mary somewhat dissatisfied. She got up to go to the kitchen to get some wine. Seeing this, Walker quickly followed her. His witty remarks made Mary unable to help but laugh. The relationship between the two grew closer, but Mary noticed Lawson's watchful gaze. Her smile immediately became unnatural. Her attitude towards him also became somewhat hostile. She bluntly said that you can't judge a person's actions when they lose their sanity. No one has the right to judge what they do when their sanity is taken away. This statement instantly killed the mood. Lawson and his companion took the hint and left. When it was time to go to bed, Mary could no longer hold back, and asked Glenn why he had told Lawson about her past infidelity. Seeing Glenn fly into a rage, Mary's emotions were also on the verge of collapse. Choking back tears, she expressed her desire to return to the past, to the time when the two of them were deeply in love, and she was willing to work hard for it. The next day, Mary excitedly told Glenn that she had booked a trip for two to Italy. Once Glenn caught the culprit, the couple could go and relax properly. This deeply moved Glenn, and for a moment, he was full of determination. He immediately went to the police station, but received some bad news right away. Someone could testify that Colin was with two women at 10 p.m. on the night of the crime, together with two women. But Lawson was not convinced, because the city where Colin worked was only a 3-hour drive from the crime scene. He could have easily returned overnight. Following that, another witness claimed to have seen Colin loitering in front of the victim's house a few days before the incident. With the testimony, Glenn could finally relax and enjoy his wine. Request to go arrest Colin. Kessler gladly agreed, and assigned him a squad of SWAT officers. But Kessler forbade Lawson from accompanying them. After all, this was an internal operation of the British police. At this moment, Colin sneakily appeared in front of someone's house. Seeing him put on a hat, ready to push the door, Glenn quickly applied to take action, following Kessler's command. All the SWAT officers filed out. Unexpectedly, this alerted Colin. Seeing this, Glenn couldn't care less. He hurried out of the command vehicle. With the help of a drone, he chased after him with large strides. Finally, he successfully arrested the frantically fleeing Colin. Now, Glenn could finally breathe a sigh of relief. He dragged his weary body back home. He wanted to share the joy with his wife. But no matter how much he called, he got no response. Glenn dialed Mary's phone, yet he heard the ringing coming from the attic. His heart skipped a beat suddenly. An ominous premonition quietly arose. Glenn steeled himself and entered the attic. Pushing open the box, he was shocked to see Mary arranged in the shape of a cross. This scene made Glenn feel as if he had been struck by lightning. He collapsed to his knees. He could never have imagined that his wife would become the target of a serial killer, especially at a time when they were about to reconcile. Until the police arrived, Glenn still hadn't come to his senses. He stayed to protect the scene but also to escape. Taking his luggage, he checked into a hotel, but he could never shake off the sadness in his heart. The next day, upon receiving the news, Walker called Glenn over. While comforting him, he expressed that he had also experienced the same pain. Therefore, he urged Glenn not to give up, to definitely find out the truth, and promised to offer his utmost help. This left Glenn very puzzled, but before he could speak, Kessler suddenly called, mentioning that the forensic team had already estimated Mary's time of death, which was just before Colin was arrested. From this, it was inferred that Colin was most likely the serial killer, and the police had also found Mary's torso in the park. Upon hearing this, Glenn immediately became restless. He rushed to the park at once. He pushed past the obstructing officers. Finally, he saw his wife's bloody body. Seeing that Glenn was about to lose control, Walker quickly held his cheeks, emphasizing over and over to stay calm. But it was no use. Glenn's hatred for Colin had reached its peak. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Meanwhile, Colin was being interrogated. He did not deny appearing at the victim's doorstep, but he insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. Seeing this, Kessler decided to try a different approach. Asked Colin if he had ever been to the United States. Unexpectedly, Colin admitted it directly, and mentioned that he had met an American in London. The American complained bitterly about the unsolved serial murder case, and described in detail the victim's manner of death. This gave Kessler a jolt. He quickly asked about the appearance of the American. But just as Colin was recalling, Glenn suddenly burst in. He angrily denounced Colin's cruel crimes. Fortunately, he was quickly taken away by Lawson. Following that, Lawson entered the interrogation room, wanting to ask Colin a few questions. However, upon seeing his face clearly, Colin's face suddenly showed a look of shock, as if he had seen Lawson before. But Lawson did not pay attention to Colin's reaction. Instead, he asked about his fate. Hearing this, Colin's shock gradually turned into a meaningful look, indicating that the two victims were both heathens. A glint of sharpness flashed in Lawson's eyes. He slowly leaned in towards Colin, wanting to continue questioning. He was forcefully interrupted by the lawyer who wanted to take Colin away. So, Lawson, with a malicious smile, pointed at Colin, as if to warn him. But Glenn couldn't accept any of this. He called Lawson to the bar, and bluntly stated that Colin was the murderer. He insisted on continuing the investigation himself. Seeing Glenn on the verge of a breakdown, Lawson began to share his own experiences, hoping to help him move past his pain and start a new life. But when he returned to his post the next day, Glenn was still visibly distraught. Lawson understood that it wasn't possible to change him overnight. So that evening, he called Glenn to the tavern again, this time with Walker accompanying them. During the conversation, Glenn kept complaining about letting Colin go, and he mentioned that he must be enjoying himself at the bar right now. Walker casually asked Glenn, "Have you searched Colin's house?" Hearing this, Glenn was initially taken aback, but then he understood what the two meant. Sometimes, a search warrant doesn't mean everything. This made it clear to Glenn what he had to do next. However, he did not anticipate that things were spiraling out of control. At this moment, Colin was just as Glenn had said, enjoying himself at the bar. As the alcohol went to his head, he staggered out the door. But just as Colin reached his car, a mysterious figure suddenly appeared, and repeatedly stabbed him with a knife. In the blink of an eye, Colin lost his life and fell in a pool of blood. The next day, Glenn, still unaware of this, woke up, and decided to quietly search Colin's house as planned. He went to the cabin in the back, and found a lock hanging on it. Then, struck by an idea, he took out the key he had found at the first victim's house. After a simple attempt, it was successfully opened. This filled Glenn with great joy. He realized that Colin must be the murderer. He informed Kessler of this matter. Then, with gun in hand, he pushed open the door. But while Glenn was searching, he suddenly found a pool of blood on the ground. He immediately realized something was wrong. He rushed into the cabin. To his shock, he saw Colin nailed to the wall. The torso was nowhere to be seen. Soon, the police cordoned off the scene. Lawson also hurried over. At this point, Glenn was still completely baffled. He couldn't understand who could be so cruel to dare lay hands on Colin, the serial killer. While the two were talking, an officer suddenly informed them that a secret room was discovered in Colin's house. Glenn and Lawson hurried to the scene, just to see information about two victims posted on the wall. This completely confirmed Colin's identity. But Glenn brought up, "There's no information about Mary above. Can't think of. Obviously, it wasn't Colin who killed her. This indicates there's another murderer. It's most likely the American that Colin met." Glenn hurried back to the police station to continue investigating these murders. Lawson started searching the security company where Colin worked. He saw a photo of him with Walker. Coincidentally, Walker called at that moment. "Have you heard of a Thames Security?" Lawson asked about it. Walker's face suddenly changed. He told Lawson to stay at the hotel and he would arrive immediately. But obviously, Lawson wouldn't just sit and wait. He forwarded the photo to Glenn. In an instant, Glenn realized the truth. Walker is the Chicago serial killer. He was also the one who inspired Colin. He rushed towards the hotel, and he informed Kessler of this news. But by this time, Walker had already entered the room. Faced with Lawson's questions, "I've seen many security companies in the UK, he explained frantically that he didn't know Colin at all. "But at the conference, I don't even." Lawson verbally expressed understanding, but secretly hid a pistol behind his back. Then he poured out the jewelry from the box, and picked up a necklace. That was exactly the trophy, taken by the murderer after Lawson's wife died. This made Walker somewhat puzzled, not understanding where Lawson had gotten it from. However, the next moment, a strong murderous intent burst from Lawson's eyes, as he aimed his gun at Walker. "You stole the love of my life, forcing me to become a serial killer. So this is the real truth of it all." Back then, Lawson found out his wife was having an affair with Walker, and in a dispute with him, accidentally killed her. To create confusion, Lawson sawed off his wife's limbs, and arranged them in the shape of a cross. And the 4 people killed after that were all accomplices during their dates. It could be said that it was Walker who turned Lawson into a demon step by step. And now, it was his turn to pay the price. Lawson meticulously set the stage to ruin Walker's reputation and life. But Walker wouldn't be captured without a fight. Suddenly, he was wrestling with Lawson. Then there was the sound of a gunshot. Walker clutched his stomach and sat on the bed in despair. At that moment, Glenn hurried over, only to find that Walker couldn't hold on any longer. Lawson, on the other hand, was fanning the flames, urging Glenn to finish off Walker himself. But Glenn, after all, was a police officer sworn to uphold the law, and could never bring himself to do it. Seeing this, Lawson quietly slipped out of the room, and Walker was completely dead. Just as Glenn turned around, he suddenly noticed the jewelry on the table. He noticed that each one matched those on the victim's body. A terrible suspicion immediately arose in his heart. Then he found 2 passports belonging to Lawson. At this point, Glenn finally understood. Lawson was the real murderer. But by the time he rushed out of the hotel, Lawson had already driven away. Glenn hurriedly started his car. The two engaged in a fierce chase on the highway. Eventually, they arrived at a forest. Glenn had just turned a corner when he suddenly saw Lawson standing ahead, repeatedly pulling the trigger at him. Glenn frantically dodged and crashed into a pile of wood. When he regained consciousness, Lawson had disappeared. Glenn, ignoring the pain, got out of the car with his gun and searched around. But Lawson was like a cat toying with its prey, hiding behind a tree, smugly telling Glenn that he had killed Mary, just to help him escape that painful life. This sentence made Glenn lose control of his emotions. He fired repeatedly at Lawson's location. But just as he was searching again, Lawson appeared behind him like a ghost. Glenn completely resigned himself to his fate. He handed over his weapons and cell phone, preparing to face death. However, Lawson only shot through his cell phone, because he wanted to change Glenn, to make him into a second version of himself. When all was said and done, Glenn imposed a strict blockade on the port. He decided to arrest Lawson. But when he opened the car door, he realized he had fallen for a decoy tactic. It was just a man who looked like Lawson, and the real Lawson was at that moment drinking strong liquor by the mountain road, seemingly celebrating his successful escape, and perhaps celebrating that he had personally changed a man. Scarred is a mystery movie released in 2024. If I were to rate this film on a 5-star scale, AK rates the character 4.5 stars. Samuel L. Jackson is also considered an old friend of ours. It's worth mentioning that he was already 75 years old at the time of filming, but it's hard to see any signs of aging on his face. This inevitably makes one curious about how he maintains himself. The plot gets 4 stars. The design of the film is quite impressive. Before the real culprit is revealed, it always gives the audience a feeling of being close yet distant, as if several main characters are suspects. And the ending goes against expectations, allowing the culprit to successfully evade the police and remain at large. Such a plot twist is indeed eye-catching. At the end of the film, Glenn is still consumed by his obsession for revenge. Do you guys think he can catch Lawson? Feel free to leave your comments and discuss. If there are any other movies you'd like to watch, please also leave the titles in the comments section. Doting on fans, AK will definitely try his best to meet the requests of his buddies. Alright everyone, today's file review will end here. Your support is the greatest encouragement for me. Please trouble everyone to like and subscribe more. I am Detective K. See you in the next file. Bye bye.